Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. Today's topic is considerations for working with the LGBTQIA plus community. And so we're excited for you to join us today. This is a kind of follow-up session to the session that was on March 6th, I think, or the first week of March, second week of March.
Yeah.
So we are joined today again with DJ Ralston and their colleague, Bridget Griffin. So I'll let them introduce themselves here in a little bit and get us started. We're just going to start with some housekeeping things like we do every Workforce Wednesday webinar. So if you've joined us on a Wednesday morning before, you're probably familiar with a lot of these items. Everything is the same. Just to introduce myself pretty briefly, my name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm the Digital Communications Manager at the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, or ICSPS. Yes, it is a mouthful. We know, we were just talking about it prior to starting the webinar with all of you. But hopefully you've heard of our center. We work in collaboration with Illinois WorkNet, and we work in collaboration with DCO and OET, and we put on the Workforce Wednesday webinars as a part of the WIOA Professional Development Committee, which I sit on. So as we're going through the housekeeping things, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone and launch our polls that we do every Wednesday for analytical purposes. So if you could tell us, where is your local area within the state, or if you're joining us from out of state, and then which partner do you best represent this morning? And you can scroll through the poll that's up, the window browser that's up, and answer number 2 as well. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just talk about the housekeeping items. So we are on Zoom webinar, not Zoom meetings. So you do not have the ability to unmute yourself. But we do ask that you fully immerse yourself in the experience and participate through the chat and the Q&A. I'll be helping facilitate the chat and the Q&A, as well as Bridget will for DJ as we have time for questions and answers towards the end of the presentation. So feel free to fully participate in that. Speaking of, let me make sure everyone can chat and say good morning to us. The PowerPoint slides are already up on our website, and I will put those in the chat here momentarily so you can directly download them. Today's session is being recorded, so we'll have that recording closed captions, edited, and everything within typically about 48 hours, and then it'll be up on our website. And you'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow that has all this information in that follow-up email. So kind of a one-stop shop. So you will have access to the follow-up survey and the website where the recording and presentation slides are at. And so we ask that you take a couple minutes to take our follow-up survey. I am on the WIOA Professional Development Committee. I'm the one who compiles all of the survey data and presents it to the committee. So if there's any future topics for professional development, or if you really loved this session and you want more information, we would love if you participated by taking the second to take our survey. So that way we know and we can communicate with you and really give the system the professional development that they need, or that you all need. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. Looks like we have a good span across the state of people, which is great. Honestly, it's pretty across the board. And then we also have, most of you are from Title I and II, but we have a couple people from Title III and other WIOA partners and stakeholders as well. So thank you for joining us this morning and spending time with us. We appreciate it. I'm going to stop sharing and let DJ share their screen. And then if you have any questions or need anything, feel free to reach out to me via the chat. I'll be here the whole session, and then I'll hand it off to DJ to get us started.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Kirsten. So y'all, I'm going to admit I am not in my home office today. So if you were with us last time, I was pretty good at seeing stuff in the chat. This time I actually probably won't, because I'm on my tiny little laptop screen. So I am certain that Bridget will also interrupt me as needed, if it makes sense, depending on where your questions are. And we should be able to get through all this with plenty of time for some actual Q&A at the end, where I'll be able to read the chat, or I think we can unmute you. So yeah, welcome to Words Matter, considerations for creating an inclusive environment for LGBTQ plus participants. If you joined us a couple of weeks ago, welcome back. Super excited to have you here. Quick funding statement. This is the obligatory legalese that says that, the views are those of the presenter and not the Department of Education. Quick shout out to a couple of my colleagues who contributed a lot of content to this. My colleagues, Catherine Hurley and Lucas DeMonte, who are not here today, but They are good friends and colleagues of mine. So my name, as we heard DJ, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a non-binary, typically describe myself as, trans-masculine, queer person. I am a geriatric millennial, which just means I was born in that really weird, space between Gen X and millennials, right? Because I'm not quite really a millennial, but I'm definitely not really a Gen Xer either. Certainly a foodie and definitely a Muppet enthusiast. I think that we should always have Muppets. I think the world would be a better place, actually, if we had Muppets everywhere, right? My professional background, just to give you all a little bit of background, while I mostly work in VR now, for those of you on the line from titles 1 and 3, so, WIO, Adult Dislocated Worker Youth, and Wagner Pizer, that's where my career started, and did a lot of work directly in the field, like in an American Job Center. So working in a resource room, doing case management, all those things. So I'm super excited that you're all here. Education is that really super important, but I'll qualify it. I'm a certified work incentive coordinator, so trained to handle stuff around benefits, have a master's degree in rehab counseling, which I actually got while working in the workforce side as a adult and dislocated worker case manager. And I'm currently working on my doctorate, and I'm in that phase of, please don't ask me about my dissertation. Areas of expertise include LGBTQIA populations, obviously a place where I, have a lot of passion as a member of the community myself. And then social security work incentives, financial empowerment, financial capability stuff, and then a lot around relationship building and partnership development. So I'm joined today by Bridget, and I'm remiss because she does not have her own slide, but Bridget, do you want to say anything?
Just hi, everybody. I am just here to support DJ today. I will try to keep up with putting some resources in the chat, but I'll also provide Kirsten with a list of those resources afterwards so that Kirsten can email them out to you. But I'm happy to be here today. I always love listening and learning about this topic. So yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Bridget. And yeah, Bridget is like the wizard behind the curtain, y'all. Like, I swear, I don't know how she does it, but she like finds stuff like as I'm staying and drops it in the chat. So hey, just, today, like just kind of approaching this place with grace, right? Like some kindness. I'm assuming you all are wonderful people. I'm assuming you're positive intent. You're here to learn and figure out how you can, better support or best support some of your participants that are LGBTQIA plus folks. Willingness to engage, please ask questions, feel free to put stuff in the chat. Like I said, I can't really see it right now because I just have my one screen and I don't want to open the chat box because I think that creates like a splotchy area for y'all, but we will definitely like kind of be tracking and capture and do our best to answer along the way. So objectives today, hopefully you'll walk away with increased knowledge and, better ability to use common language around LGBTQ plus identity, including knowing the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. If you joined us a couple weeks ago, then you know that we covered that kind of right at the end. And I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Increased understanding of the importance of strategies for creating an inclusive environment for LGBTQ plus youth and students. But like when I say that, I'm thinking like the broad range, right? Like 14 to 24. And honestly, most of this is also super applicable to the adults that you're working with who are members of the population too. So, it's pretty much transferable all over the place. Increased understanding of transition as it relates to gender identity. So including thinking about transition from a social, legal, and medical aspect. And, right now there is a boatload kind of out there about transition. And I think it's really important that we unpack some of that because typically when you say any type of gender transition, I think, what's currently out there in the landscape, the national landscape right now is people are immediately jumping to, sex reassignment surgeries and those types of things. So we, which isn't even terminology that we actually use anymore, but that's certainly things that are being brought up these days. So hopefully we can also unpack some of the nuances that come with being a trans person or non-binary person and applying for work, including issues around disclosure and all of those types of things. So just to kind of set the background here, I wanted to start with kind of the current landscape, right? So what is it that we are talking about? So the Trevor Project does a huge mental health survey every year. So in 2021, because this is the 2022 survey data, 34,000 LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 and 24 across the United States were surveyed. And with that, 45% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. 45% seriously considered suicide. Like, that's pretty big. Of that, of those that considered it, like when we look at that breakdown by, racial identity, so 43% of white youth seriously considered suicide last year, compared to 49% of Black youth, 46% of Latinx, Latino, Latina youth, 47% of Middle Eastern or North African youth, and 55% of Indigenous youth. So this just kind of speaks to, the emphasis of what happens when intersectionality comes into play. So we talked about a couple of weeks ago, right? The idea that when you hold more than one marginalized identity, or more than one identity that's not necessarily considered the norm, right? That can add emphasis to different layers of advantage and different layers of oppression. And so this is where I think we kind of see some of that. So of the, that was youth that seriously considered suicide. 14% of LGBTQ youth actually attempted suicide in the past year. When we break that down, 12% of white youth attempted suicide compared to 19% of Black youth, 16% for Latinx, Latino, Latina, 20% of Middle Eastern, North African youth, and 21% of Native and Indigenous youth. Again, this is just an opportunity for us to kind of highlight, right? Like the fact that there is added, there's additional, stress or pressure, and that comes with, different social identities. So the other thing I think it's really important to point out here is that 60% of LGBTQ youth who wanted mental health care in the past year were not actually able to get it. And the reasons cited for that kind of range from everything from, access and reassurance or whatever, confidence rather, about, getting a gender and or an LGBTQ affirming therapist, to like concerns about parents finding out, all sorts of things, to just not having that type of access. So the other thing I thought it's important to point out here is that 36% of youth, of LGBTQ youth, reported having been physically threatened or harmed due to their sexual orientation or gender identity within the last year. So that's, that's a third of the population. So moving on here. So now, conversely, what do we know is really important? Well, we know that LGBTQ youth who felt high social support from their families reported attempting suicide at less than half the rate of those who felt low or moderate social support. We also know that LGBTQ youth who live in a community that is accepting reported significantly lower rates of attempting suicide than those who do not. So what we're really saying is, hey, your support matters, right? You're the ones working with these young folks, even young adults, right? Your support matters. So we see that we see far less, rates of suicide than without, when they have a supportive adult. And I believe the statistic somewhere is something like, one supportive and affirming adult in the life of an LGBTQ plus youth can reduce the attempted rate of suicide by like 45%, which is a huge statistic when we think about it. So y'all really do matter. And that's why you're here. So let's talk a bit about this, right? So language matters, right? And I talked a little bit about that last time, but language is really important because it really does help people, find their community, and it can help people really contribute to their identity. And so, sometimes we can talk about like, well, labels is just an excuse for people to tell you you're doing it wrong. But at the same time, I think it really does, like, a label is normally a starting place. And so as young people are, figuring their identities out and really kind of getting those directions, like, it's going to help folks find their community. You heard me, I'm like, oh, I'm a non-binary, like trans mask person. So, what does that actually mean? Well, for me, that means that, like, I'm not necessarily feel like a woman. I don't necessarily like fully feel like a man, but I tend to definitely lean more in the masculine direction. Like I'm wearing a shirt and tie, you know, you wouldn't catch me in a dress or skirt or anything like that. So, you know, the other thing that's really important here, right, is that there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of differences in beliefs, like even within our own community, right? So even under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, people are going to be, you know, different, right? And I know that that probably feels like, well, DJ, isn't that obvious? But sometimes we need to state the obvious. So, you know, we're not a monolith, it's going to change. And, you know, I actually talk about this too, like the word queer, for example, like I often will use that as an umbrella term to describe myself and many others in the community, but there are also members of our community who, you know, don't want to use that word, don't like that word, because as they came up with it, like, you know, they saw it as really derogatory. It was something that was used in a derogatory way against them, right? So, you know, they've never really recovered from that. Like, you know, I see it as a reclamation of the term. So that's for me. Like, P.S. I meant to say too, if you are a member of the community and you feel comfortable weighing in the chat, by all means, please do, because I'm only one person. I only have my own lived experience to offer. And my experience, kind of speaking to this point about LGBTQ plus, you know, not folks not being a monolith, my experience, right, as a white kind of, you know, trans masculine, non-binary human is going to be really different than that of, you know, perhaps like a Latina lesbian or, you know, perhaps a trans woman who's Black, or, you know, those experiences are going to really differ. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I'll say, constantly changing landscape. Look, the words keep changing, so that gets annoying for folks. I get it. But it is important to kind of keep up with that. Like, you know, in terms of orientation, one of the new labels I've heard is like, oh, I'm like polysexual. Well, what does that mean? Like, how is polysexual different than pansexual? So those types of things, like the language kind of keeps evolving. And so, you know, paying attention to that, because that again is how people are starting to try and like kind of sort out and find their identity and where they belong. So oftentimes, you know, we're going to determine pretty quickly if we think you're a safe person. And that's especially true for youth. I think we all know that we can feel like young folks, teenagers in particular, might judge adults. I think that that's not a lie. But, you know, I think that particularly when I think about my own identity, I'm constantly calculating, like, is this a safe place for me to disclose, you know, who I am? And I will tell you, I've been in situations where I'm like, yeah, it's not safe for me to say, hi, my name is DJ, my pronouns are they, them. You know, so it's unfortunate, but it's something to think about. Anyway, so you really do want to do your best, right? And that's why you're all here, to start thinking about how can we create these more inclusive environments, right? The other thing is we talk about this a lot in the disability field, and I recognize that there's not a lot of you that are here from the disability side today, because I didn't see anybody from Title IV from VR, but, you know, and even in your professional roles, I'm sure we've all been kind of raised with this idea of, oh, it's a person with a disability instead of a disabled person, right? A person with autism instead of somebody who's autistic. But the reality is that language and that landscape is changing a lot. And we're seeing, you know, people really kind of claim their identities. This is the same idea with queer, right? Like, so queer is no longer a dirty derogatory word for most people. They often are claiming that as an identity. So thinking about kind of identity first, language is important, and listening to how your participants who hold multiple social identities talk about themselves. You know, if the person that you're working with, you know, identifies, for example, as a disabled trans, like Latina woman, then that is something that you can base your understanding off of like, oh, this is part of her identity. So, you know, just thinking about what's informing your language, I think is really helpful. So wanted to talk a little bit about gender identity versus orientation, and really kind of explicitly start with gender identity, because one of the things that happens, and if you were on the session 2 weeks ago, you know, I said this at the end, but because we're all under the rainbow, right, LGBTQIA+, because they lump gender identity and orientation in the same place, these two things often get conflated and they are not the same thing. So, you know, your gender identity is really about who you are, whereas your sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. I said it, and this seems kind of crass a little bit, but I think that it's spot on. So your gender identity is who you go to bed as, whereas your orientation is who you want to go to bed with. And that was actually stated by a pediatric endocrinologist during a TED Talk. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to steal that. So anyway, but let's talk a little bit about gender identity. So Glesson, in partnership with Interact, developed what they call the gender triangle as a means to kind of really help people understand gender identity. So gender identity, basic definition, if we look in the center of that triangle, you see kind of the brain there, and it's like how you see yourself on the inside. So yeah, your gender identity is actually your innermost sense of what your gender is, like, and how you see yourself, like, you know, what is it that you, when you close your eyes and you picture yourself, like, how is your gender showing up? Like, what does that feel like for you, right? It's your innermost sense of who you are. So then this kind of, you know, exists, right? Like gender identity tends to exist in three ways. The expression, which is your gender expression, which is how you present yourself. So for me, right, I'm like, oh, I present myself as masculine. Totally 100%. Look, you know, all the things that gender says, right? Like, you know, short hair, I'm wearing a shirt and tie, like, you know, I even sometimes my posture, although I have terrible posture, but like just kind of the ways that like I tend to present myself tend to be more masculine, right? So there's your expression, that's how you present yourself. Then there's attribution, right? So what is attribution? Well, that's how other people perceive your gender, right? So your attribution is really like, or attribution is really what other people are looking at and thinking about or categorizing you as. So if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, right, we talked about how our brain creates these cognitive shortcuts. And one of the first things that we do is categorize people because our brains are like literally processing so much information at once. So, you know, people tend to process into a very binary, right, man or woman or boy or girl, right? They attribute very quickly what they perceive your gender to be based on things like your secondary sex characteristics, right? So whether somebody has facial hair, whether somebody has, you know, breasts, whatever that looks like, right? Because that also gets to that third part of the triangle, which is your body. And then there's this idea of how your body exists, right? So, and how your body changes. And here's the thing that's really interesting is bodies are actually really complex. And, you know, I know that we were all taught like XX, XY, and, you know, certain physical reproductive anatomy or genitalia, right, like determines all of these things. It's actually far more complicated than that. When we really think about gender, gender is a combination of typically of genitalia, of hormones, of chromosomes, and of secondary sex characteristics. So that's like 4 big categories, and not always do all these things align. So when we try to like boil it down to basic biology, says basic biology is actually not that basic. So just wanted to make that point. Bridget, is there anything super, like I see comments like flags, so I'm just checking.
Yes, yep. There's a question in the chat, DJ, and it's a really interesting one because it's kind of gets at that. Ooh, how do I deal with this within my organization? So Emily asked, said that they're new to their organization, but they have an EO officer, so an equal opportunity officer that seems to be gatekeeping trainings for staff. This person ran a bias and diversity training last week and it did not end well. They are white, cis, and not well versed in these subjects. They're planning to do a training coming up in May on LGBTQIA issues. Just wondering, you know, I think how to address that, or are there local resources? I did actually put something in the chat about the equal opportunity monitoring in Illinois, like a resource for them to reach out to if they're not feeling good about what's happening, but maybe also could provide other resources, but just wondered if you have anything to add to that.
Ooh, yeah, that's a sticky situation. So presuming that the EEO person is not your immediate supervisor, maybe talking to your, like, to the leadership in your office about your concerns about that gatekeeping, and or the other thought about it would be just encouraging and again, you probably would need to go to your leadership, but even having a conversation with the EO person about the importance of having some folks with lived experience talk about it from their perspective. I think that that's always kind of a gentle way for us to help folks understand that, hey, it's great. This it's kind of interesting. That's actually a really good question, Emily, because there's a lot of nuance here, right? So we don't want to put all of the labor on folks from the populations who have been marginalized, right? Because that just I will say it gets exhausting to have to constantly educate people. But at the same time, you also do really want that lived experience component. That is a really important piece. And especially if you feel like this isn't being handled very well. So, I think Bridget, what Bridget mentioned, thinking about, who's responsible for the overall EO stuff going on. But I would think about, in your center, like, is there other leadership as long as, the EO officer, if they're not the one in charge. The other thing you might consider is talking to the workforce board or putting your head together with, ICSPS. So Kirsten, just thinking like maybe Emily could reach out to you and see if ICSPS has any ideas about how they could approach it too.
Right. DJ, I was also going to mention that, I will send that list of resources, and it does have some Illinois specific resources around these issues. So there might be a way, I don't know how you bypass your EO officer if you were to do that, but there are some local resources that could be invited for a presentation. So that might just present some ideas at least.
Yeah. And I love that idea of, leaning on your local resources and going to maybe even if you haven't had the chance to have that conversation with the EO officer, I don't know how comfortable you feel having that conversation, or maybe a couple of you from your office approaching the EO officer and just saying, hey, we know that you're planning on doing this. We're super excited for it. And we think it's really great to get some lived experience, and like even handing that EO officer, like, a connection or like kind of the information on a local LGBTQ resource center that they might be able to tap into. That might be good. So, you can also feel free to share today's slide deck with them. Like just saying, because these will be made available. But anyway, so Emily, hopefully that answers your question for now. So differences, gender identity, sexual orientation, remember? So we said, your orientation is who you're attracted to. So we talk about sexual, affectual. So just like if we think affect, like, kind of emotional, romantic, all of those things. So we kind of like wrap up our orientations there. So the typical ones you probably hear: gay, lesbian, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. You might be like, DJ, what's the difference between bisexual and pansexual? Well, y'all, that depends on who you're going to ask. Some folks tend to think that bisexual is associated really with the gender binary. So people are attracted to both like men and women, and that's it, right? So maybe that excludes non-binary people, which is, I think, where the kind of pansexual label came up, which was, to be attracted to kind of all genders, regardless of presentation. And then polysexual is attraction to multiple genders, but not necessarily all genders, and maybe in romantic ways, but not in physical ways. So you really, if somebody, for me, like one of the things I try to do, like when somebody will use a very specific label about their orientation, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean for you? And sometimes I'll be like, for me, like, this is what I like. Oh, so you're, attracted to, and then I kind of give some examples, and then that kind of opens it up for people. It's not really super duper important, to be honest, unless somebody's like really emphatically kind of putting it out there and is like, but what I would say there is like, that is a way to just kind of like ease into that conversation a little bit. And then again, gender identity is one's innermost concept of themselves as male or female or not either, or, and they're like, one's gender identity can be the same as or different from sex assigned at birth. And if it's the same as, that's when you are cisgender. So in other words, which is not a dirty word. I feel like sometimes like, cisgender or cis, like people can be like, oh, that's derogatory. It's not at all. Cis just means same, just like trans means like, different. So the different gender identity, like terms associated with gender identity that we see a lot: transgender, non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, gender expansive, gender nonconforming. So we do have a link at the bottom of this slide to all the glossaries of terms. So I was going to go through at least the gender identity terms and really break these down more specifically for folks. So cisgender, again, that's used to describe an individual whose gender identity and expression align with the sex assigned at birth. So if when you were born, the doctor yelled out, "It's a boy," and you're now grown and you identify as a man, congratulations, you are cisgender, right? And then gender binary is really the classification of gender into two discrete categories of male and female. And then gender dysphoria. This is something else that I feel like is a big buzzword or gets a lot of play right now. So what do you need to know about gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is the discomfort or distress related to the incongruence that somebody can feel between their individual gender identity and the gender, presumably based on, again, sex assigned at birth. Okay, so gender dysphoria, the thing that we need to know about gender dysphoria is it can actually be a root cause for other presenting issues: anxiety, particularly social anxiety, depression, right? Like that distress and discomfort can become debilitating in some instances. Is this the case in all folks? No. The level of gender dysphoria is gonna, vary. Again, just like we all vary as human beings, this amount of gender dysphoria can really vary. Some people will feel, significant amounts of gender dysphoria. Other people will feel very little. Some people, in fact, can still be trans and maybe not have that gender dysphoria. And people are like, but wait, how does that work? I think a lot of it really is just kind of a personal, level of comfort. I think sometimes it has to do with how people are raised, how their bodies were talked about, kind of all of that cultural and social information that we were like, that was essentially downloaded as we were growing up, right? Because if we think back to that training a couple of weeks ago, thinking about how we're influenced by media, social media, all of those things, right? So gender dysphoria is going to vary from person to person. And there might be some things that cause people to be super dysphoric, and there might be some things, not at all. So, perhaps a trans woman who has a pretty prominent Adam's apple, that could be something that could be really gender dysphoria inducing for her, right? For a trans man, maybe it's like how wide his hips are. You never know. So people can also be dysphoric and more dysphoric about certain parts than others. Expression, we talked about that, so I'm going to leave that alone. And again, gender identity itself, I'm going to leave alone. Bridget, I see questions come, so I'm just checking in.
No, we're all good, DJ. There's a really good response and a helpful resource for Emily that another person in the audience posted. So I think that's great.
I love it. Love you all when you do that. Love that you're helping each other out. Fantastic. Okay, so gender nonconforming. So this is the part where I said, remember, nuance and all these things also sound the same. So you're like, wait a minute, why does this why do these things sound the same? So gender nonconforming describes an individual whose gender identity or expression differs from gender norms associated with sex assigned at birth. Gender queer describes an individual whose gender identity doesn't align with a binary understanding of gender. So this feels very similar to non-binary too. So again, it really is just about what folks where they fall and kind of think about themselves. So, again, genderqueer might include those who think of themselves as both male or female, neither of those, moving between genders, a third gender, or outside of gender altogether. And then, non-binary is typically a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary folks may identify as being both man and woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside the categories. And here's the other thing. You heard me say well, I'm a non-binary trans mask person, right? Not everybody who's non-binary will associate with the term transgender with their identity. Some non-binary folks are and will say I'm a non-binary trans person. Some people will not. So again, thinking about and kind of listening to your participants and how they talk about themselves is really important. So what does it mean to be trans affirmative? This is a big thing right now too. Being trans affirmative, all it really means is just being aware of and respectful and supportive of the needs of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. All right, you all are here, I think, because you have an interest in being trans affirmative, right? You want to use somebody's identified pronouns. You want to use somebody's chosen name. We're going to get to those pieces, right? But that's why you're here. That's what it means to be trans affirmative. Just letting people know, hey, I see you, you know, and I value you as you are. And then thinking about transgender, it's typically thought of as an umbrella term, which to encompass people whose identities or gender roles differ from those typically associated with the sex that they're assigned at birth. Again, bottom of the slide, when you're in here, there's links to where we are pulling all the terms from. Trans man is someone who's transgender and identifies as a man. A trans woman is someone who's transgender and identifies as a woman. The best way I can think about this, you all, is just take the word transgender or trans in particular. It's an adjective, right? It's a descriptor. So a trans man, so that's why we don't say things like a transgender or transgendered or transgenderism, despite what the current political media might say. Those are inappropriate. And I'll talk about, you know, kind of the bad, like the out of date terms at the end. So, you know, again, a trans woman, someone who's transgender and identifies as a woman, someone who's trans and non-binary means they're non-binary and they identify as transgender, or they're transgender and identify as non-binary. Pansexual, this is the one that I'm like, I don't know why this orientation word is clumped in with gender stuff, but, you know, well, anyway. Pansexual is really describing somebody who has the potential for emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction to people of any gender. So whether they're cisgender, transgender, non-binary, transgender, whatever, though this may not like be at the same time, and it may vary in this, like, you know, it may not be to the same extent or same degree. Someone who is out or outing is living openly in terms of their sexual orientation and or gender identity, where and when it feels appropriate to them. Okay. So we talked about, well, maybe we didn't, I talked about this last week, sorry. But you don't want to out somebody. All right. It's just, we need to know if someone is out. So that's why we talk about outing is exposing someone's LGBTQ plus identity without their permission. And the reason that you can't out people is because this can have serious repercussions on employment, on economic stability, on personal safety, or religious and family situations. So if you were on the training a couple of weeks ago, you'll recall that I said it wasn't until the summer of 2020 that LGBTQ plus people finally got protections in employment, right? They finally got them in 2020. So it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of, you know, LGBTQ identity, but that doesn't necessarily, meaning you can't fire somebody because of that, but that doesn't, we all know that that doesn't always hold up, number one, but this is really important. This can have huge impact, especially for young people under the age of majority who are economically dependent on their, you know, families, or the, you know, their living situation can be impacted. So we do not want to out somebody. So if somebody comes out to you in any way or discloses their, you know, identity, whether, or their orientation, the first thing that we say is, wow, thank you for like sharing that with me and trusting me with that information. And like, who are you out to? Like, are you out at home? Are you out, you know, do you want to be out in the program? All of those things need to be considered. So talking about pronouns, there are typically, you know, kind of three categories of pronouns, right? Feminine, she, her, hers. I think you all are familiar with that one. Masculine, he, him, his. We also see more folks using gender neutral pronouns, including they, them, their. And then there's also gender neutral pronouns that are sometimes referred to as neo pronouns. And like, this is just a small sampling, like they, her, and hers. So they went to the store. I spoke to her. It was hers apple. Like, there are a wide range of, you know, neo pronouns as well. So like, you'll see like XE, like they, them, like, so it's, you know, something worth kind of looking at. So if you encounter somebody who's like, I use these pronouns, you know, it's fair to say, okay, great. Like, can you just pronounce those for me? Or can you spell them if you're kind of like learning those things? And if you're doing that with authenticity, you know what, we talk a lot about this. Like, you know, I talked about this at the beginning in terms of grace. Like, a lot of us recognize that some of these things are new, and really what we're looking for is that genuine kind of authentic desire on the part of the person that we're talking with, right, to really want to see us. And if you're making those efforts, we know you're going to mess up. And when you do, don't worry. Like, we're going to talk about how you like just simply need to correct yourself and move on. Just point being, like, if you're being authentic and genuine in this, like, most of us in the community are going to give you some grace around that. Now, is that true for everybody? Might you get snapped at upon occasion? Yeah. But you know what? I would chalk that up to perhaps the person that snaps at you is having a bad day. And I would, ask for your grace, or ask for you all to like extend some grace to that person as well, because, I think we've all had a bad day every now and then, right? Part of this is really just, let's be human and kind to each other. And I know I'm not telling you all anything you don't know, but so for folks who might, have a hard time with they, them, and might want to push back a little bit and are like, no, it's not grammatically correct. Well, you know what? The most interesting man in the world will say, he doesn't always use they as a singular pronoun, but when he does, he's being gender inclusive, right? So just so you know, it was actually Merriam-Webster's, dictionary's like 2019 word of the year. And the use of singular they, them has been adopted by the Associated Press style book, as well as the Chicago Manual of Style and the American Psychological Manual, or American Psychological Association Manual, APA style. So Chicago MLS, right? Like, so in other words, and the Associated Press like style book, all of the major media outlets, as well as the major academic publishing outlets, have all adopted the singular use of they. So it is something that's there. I would also say to you, I would challenge you to listen to your own language if you feel like you're someone who's struggling with it, because I think you would find that you use the singular use of they and them far more than you've ever realized. So, perhaps you're like thinking about, you were just in a big group of people, right? And everybody's walking away. Let's say you just finished a little like pickleball, because I hear that's the fastest growing sport in America, right? And you're all walking away from the pickleball courts because you're headed out to go have some celebratory like post-game drinks. And you look behind and you see that there is a scarf laying on the ground, right? But you don't know whose it is. So you yell out to the group ahead of you, hey, someone left their scarf. Right? So we use singular there all the time. Like, and you will find that you use singular them, like they, them all the time if you start listening to your own language. This is just, Spider-Man. I still feel like Spider-Man when people get my pronouns right. When they don't necessarily assume. But especially once I've said, hi, my name's DJ, I use they, them pronouns. And when people use my pronouns, it still feels like really euphoric, the opposite of kind of dysphoric, right? So let's talk a little bit about transition.
DJ, just before you go there, I just want to acknowledge
I'm totally going to file that one away. So that's super exciting. Also, yes, thank you for bringing up the fact that people often use combinations of pronouns, right? Yeah. And so I think, yes, the safest thing is to ask. I also know that like for a lot of folks, if they list they, she, or she, they, sometimes folks will list the pronoun that they prefer the most, even though they're comfortable with either first. But yeah, simply just asking that question, and honestly making an effort to use both of the pronouns, right? And what's really cool about that is it's also a really good opportunity for you if you're somebody who's newer to like, trying to figure out how to navigate all of the language and use things. It's a good opportunity to practice. I pretty much almost automatically default to referring to someone as singular they, them, especially because I don't often, unless I very much know their gender, I think that's, yeah. So I appreciate you, audience. This is exactly what we wanted. I'm just sad that I can't see the chat today without like blocking part of your screen. So thank you for your contributions. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about transition. So We're looking at it from the APA standpoint, because at this point, typically, well, anyway, so transition is the process of shifting toward a gender role different from that assigned at birth. This can include social transition, such as new names, pronouns, clothing, and medical transition, such as hormone therapy or surgery. I'm going to actually break these down even further. To do that, I'm actually going to borrow from Chris Mosier, who actually is a Illinois-based wonderful trans man and advocate and trans athlete. So he did this whole great thing on his Instagram, and I'm like, why reinvent the wheel? And I can just basically credit Chris with this. So we're going to talk through this. He is a professional speaker, pro athlete for Nike, All-American, 2-time national champion, 6-time member of Team USA as a in the sport of triathlon specifically. Now he's a professional speaker. So he kind of breaks this down, like, so what does it mean to transition? First of all, for anybody not familiar, the blue, pink, and white flag, that is the trans flag. That is our trans identity flag. But so transition refers to the process a transgender individual takes to live consistently with their gender identity, right? And there are actually 3 main kind of buckets when we think about transition. There's the social transition, medical transition, and legal transition. And for us as professionals who are working with folks to help them get jobs, the reason that I like it broken out like this is because this is helpful, because it helps us think about some of the nuance and things that we would run into. So, but before we get there, what's important to know is that transition is essentially, it's a lifelong process, right? Like, particularly if someone starts taking exogenous hormones, so hormones that aren't typically produced, so, that aren't typically produced in their body. So, when people talk about, hey, I transitioned X years ago, they're typically referring to when they start their process. So, like, I have a lot of trans men friends, trans male friends, who will like talk about when they started taking hormones as like their maniversary, right? Super corny. And if you're outside the community, you can't say things like that. But being in the community, again, kind of like that nuance and understanding like the kind of the social rules, right? But like, so people will say, I transitioned X years ago. Well, that's typically when they started taking hormones, although not always. That may be when they first came out. Maybe that's when they think about it. So again, if somebody says like, oh, I transitioned X years ago, and you're like, oh, what does that mean? Like, you can say, oh, is that when you like, changed your name, or is that when you came out, right? Because quite frankly, when it comes to medical transition, what I'm going to tell you all is most of it's none of your business. All right. We'll get there, but that's because transition is an extremely personal process. All right. And transition can be different for every person. And there's no right way to transition. There's no kind of succession of steps that somebody has to take. And the goal of how somebody transitions, or what one's transition goal is really individual, and it's up to that person. There's no blueprint. Some of the steps can be, or any of these steps that we're going to talk about can be taken in any order, right? So some people may decide to start physically transitioning, or maybe have a gender affirming surgery before they ever actually, come out. There are some folks who won't do that at all. There are some folks who have no medical transition, and that's fine too. Taking or not taking any of these steps doesn't make anybody any more trans or any less trans. That's an important piece of this, okay? And that's because ultimately, when we think about our gender identities, folks, what is it? It's your innermost sense of who you are, right? It's the innermost sense of what your gender is. So even if you choose to never medically transition, even if you choose to never come out, but internally a person considers themselves to be transgender, that's fine. They may not share that with anybody. So really what I'm saying is there's no blueprint, and Chris does a good job of this. So let's, and I guess, again, to just kind of reiterate, people can do all of these things, or they can do none of them and still be transgender, or they can do just a couple here and there. All right. So social transition can include things like changing one's name or pronouns. Well, guess what, y'all? I started socially transitioning when I was like 7 years old, because that's when I changed my name. That's when I stopped using my full name and started going by DJ. And I've been DJ since I was 7 years old. P.S. I also cut off my hair at that point. I grew it out again, but then I cut it off again, right? So Social transition is often things like name, pronouns people are using, hairstyle, clothing, other kind of physical expressions like, like mannerisms, speech. It can include the restrooms that people use, like all and more, right? So socially transitioning also, PS, is typically a lifelong process because a lot of times, because of the way that our society is structured, people will automatically assume one's gender, right? So for me, social transition is an everyday process because every day I have to introduce myself, with my pronouns, and or pretty much every day I have to remind, because I meet a lot of new people, I have to remind people, oh no, my pronouns are they, them, right? So thinking about social transitioning is something that actually can be lifelong as well. So let's talk a little bit about medical transition. So medical transition is typically what everybody assumes based on what's in the news right now. When you say transition, people immediately actually typically jump to three things because these are the big fights, right? Hormone blockers, or puberty blockers as they're called, hormone therapy, but in particular also gender affirming surgery. So let me, medical transition can include, but may not. It may include the use of hormone blockers. It may include the use of gender affirming therapy or surgery like electrolysis or laser hair removal. It could include surgery like other affirming surgeries, and it can include hormone therapy. So a couple of things just to set the record straight. In the United States, people under the age of 18 cannot have gender affirming surgery that removes any of their reproductive anatomy or organs. So in other words, what's sometimes referred to as bottom surgery is not happening under the age of 18. There's 6 cases in the United States, actually currently, I just read the stat on it, where that's occurred. And guess what? Parental consent was required. All right. So that's an important piece of this because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation out there and people immediately jump to the fact that, people assigned male at birth are having their physical anatomy cut off under the age of 18. That's not actually happening. Now, there are some folks who are assigned female at birth who are having breast tissue removed, or what is commonly referred to as top surgery, but even that number is surprisingly low. I think I just read it, and it was like 256 people under the age of 18 had top surgery with parental consent. And when you compare that to the 14,000 assigned female at birth people who had rhinoplasties or nose jobs last year, which also dramatically alters one's, just wanted to give you some of those statistics. So medical transition can include some of these. It can include all of them. Some people choose to never medically transition. Some people, may choose to, perhaps a young person chooses to use hormone blockers or puberty blockers for a bit of time while they can kind of pause puberty until they decide, you know what, no, I do want to go through with my traditional puberty. And so then they stop taking the blockers and they go through the puberty based on, the hormone that's in their body. So that's the other thing, y'all, is if you've noticed just kind of the way that I talk about this, right? Like I typically talk about hormone, like typical hormone-based bodies, right? I try not to gender bodies based on these assumptions that we've these social constructions that we've built around gender. And I'll be honest, I'm like the rest of you all. I've been steeped in this my whole life, right? I'm 41 years old. There are still like biases, even as a trans person, that I have to undo. And there's still mistakes that I make. So, I just try to be accountable when I do. Okay, last part, legal transition, because this one is also really important. And where the interplay comes in for us is what happens when somebody may have medically transitioned, but hasn't legally transitioned. And I'll get into that in a minute. But legally transitioning is really just kind of referring to the process of when somebody changes typically their name and sometimes their gender marker, depending on where they live, if it's allowed, on things like their driver's license, what's associated with their social security card or their birth certificate. Some states allow it, some states don't. And I apologize, I should have looked to see if Illinois did, and I did not check. But bank account, credit cards, job-related documents, academic records, medical, so there's all the legal stuff is kind of the legal transition part. And that actually can really impact when somebody's looking for work. So again, just hammering this point, not every person wants to medically transition. Doing so or not doing so doesn't make anybody any less trans. There's no right way to transition. There's only a right way for you. So that's one of the things that we talk about. So what can you do, right, in your state? And I'm sure Bridget's going to go find links now because she's super good at this, but supporting gender expansive and transgender individuals within your state. So kind of familiarizing yourself with the legalities of transition in your state. What does that look like in Illinois, right? So what does it look like for an adult? What does it look like for a minor, right? What about government ID? Like what is on the what process does it require? Some states, require that somebody has had some form of gender affirming surgery typically before they can change it, like depending on where you live. Or maybe that's the case, maybe that's not required for your ID, but that's the case if like for your birth certificate. Understanding what the name change process is, costs, fee waivers. I can guarantee you that like the LGBTQ rights organization of Illinois probably runs free legal clinics where they do, kind of overviews about how somebody goes about changing their name. I know that, by the way, I live in Ohio. So I know in Ohio, that's something that a lot of several of our bigger LGBTQ plus resource centers will do. And a lot of times they'll do it virtually. So they'll run that clinic, they'll talk about the process. So like in Ohio, you actually have to print your name in a circulating newspaper for 30 days. I'm like, geez, talk about like not updating with the times, huh? I didn't even know that newspapers still circulate. Anyway, so what does that look like? And then the other thing is, familiarize yourself with the federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. Right now, there's a lot of laws being proposed that are discriminatory, bottom line. So there's a great website called the Movement Advancement Project, which I'm sure Bridget's going to go find, and you can look at every state's profile related to LGBTQIA plus, profiles. So you can see kind of what the protections are. And it's really great. It has a rating, like kind of, you get negative points or positive points depending on, or your state, by the way. It gets negative points or positive points depending on the protections that are available, et cetera. So what can you do? Well, the idea is we want to foster conditions for people to like feel safe in our space and in our presence. And I say we want to do our best to foster these conditions because ultimately, guess what? We can't actually determine if the space is safe or not. Only the participant who is like part of this marginalized group gets to determine that, right? So understanding, y'all, that there's an inherent power differential in the relationship that you have with your participants, all right? And that's because they're coming to you for help, which means you are automatically, right? Like you've automatically kind of, hold the power in this relationship. If we kind of layer on top of that, the fact that oftentimes you are working with younger folks, we know that sometimes age differentials can shift power dynamics. You add on top of that, perhaps somebody is from a racialized, minoritized background, right? You add on top of that somebody's LGBTQIA identity, all of those things, right? So that's why we did this session a couple of weeks ago, because we wanted to really talk about those, kind of power differentials and think about the fact that we are careful with that. So, safety is going to look different for everyone. And ultimately your participants are going to decide whose space is safe and who's not, or what's not. And we need to understand that when we layer kind of these additional identities on top of, on top of each other, these can create those different levels of oppression. And we saw that in those very first slides, right? Like, so we know that the rate of attempted suicide is high for LGBTQIA youth, but we know it's higher for LGBTQIA youth who are, members of different marginalized and minoritized racial backgrounds, right? We know that, so we can see that there. I think recognizing that we can be knowledgeable on one thing, but not necessarily all things, it is really important too. So, sometimes you might share some of those identities with some of the people that you're working with. And so you can acknowledge that from that space, but recognizing that we don't have people's specific lived experience. I know too, right? Like we see a lot of folks who are living at or below, the poverty level, right? And understanding kind of the stress that's associated with that and how that can impact people's ability to show up and participate in our programming, right? So there's all these things that we want to think about and do our best to like make space for, and also recognize we may not know that much. Like, I'll be honest, like I know that like, somebody mentioned earlier, somebody was like, oh, thinking about folks that are asexual or folks that are aromantic, so aro or ace. We hear a lot about those identities, like, and I'll be honest, that's something that I can't speak to really well because that isn't my experience, but I recognize that. And I'm like, when I encounter folks who are ace or aro, I'm like, hey, like, can we talk about that? Again, kind of from a little bit of a different place, but just the idea being that we don't always all know it all, right? So how can we show up? Well, you want to show up authentically, you want to be open-minded, you want to be accountable, if you can do so with humor and forgiveness, like that's what's important, just being yourself and being open to that. That's why we, again, like open with a slide about, listening to understand instead of respond, and thinking about like how we show up with grace, and like those are what we do, and I think that the other thing you can think about is challenging your own worldviews and increasing your cultural responsiveness, which clearly you all are interested in increasing your cultural responsiveness and humility because you're here, right? You're here today. You showed up a couple of weeks ago. You're looking at these things like, Emily, clearly you're thinking about it. So thank you for that. Like, because you're going to those trainings. And so, that's important. That's what we do. So from, safe spaces to like actively affirming people, well, consider your application and intake process, folks. Bridget, do we have any more
Actually, DJ, you're just going to address the question. Kelly put a question in chat about the application and documentation process that is not inclusive. So I think you're actually going to address it now in this slide. I just wanted to bring it to your attention, but I think it goes very much along with the safe space discussion. And from the very outset, how can we create that safe space? And Kelly is saying, hey, we don't do this. How can we work to change this? So I think you're going to address that right now.
Yeah, so there's some good stuff like, Kelly, I love that you're bringing it up and you were already thinking about it before we even got there. So first of all, the one thing that you can control is your own actions. So if you're sitting here and you're going, God, I don't do any of this, that's okay, because guess what? How hard is it for the next time you to do an intake for you to say, oh, hey, do you have a name you go by? Like, or do you have a preferred name? Here's the other thing I'm going to say. One of the first things you can do actively, especially if you're cisgender, is to introduce yourself by saying, hi, my name is DJ. I use they, them. Only, don't use my name and my pronouns. Insert your name, insert your pronouns. And do that to just start to normalize it, right? Now, I know within an intake, you have to report, typically what is, what's considered sex, right? So that's an opportunity to have a discussion instead of just making assumptions, right? And, or if you're handing somebody some paperwork for them to fill out the application because your application just records sex and gives the male female option. Yeah. Can you go to your leadership, in your program? Like, maybe this is something that your, leadership can talk to the Workforce Development Board about in terms of how they alter, their applications. Now, it may not be something that's a quick fix. It may be something that, particularly if you all are collecting all this information online because you're using, some type of management information system where somebody creates a profile so that way they can look for jobs and you recognize, oh, this is not inclusive at all. Those are conversations then you want to raise to your Workforce Development Board, and your Workforce Development Board needs to raise that to, to Illinois Department of Workforce Development. I can't remember all your acronyms, whatever, but, and like, this is an opportunity to do that. But what you can control right away is that when you are doing an intake in person, in addition to asking someone their name, like, hey, do you have a nickname or a name you go by or a preferred name? That's literally what you can do right there. Because guess what? How many times when we're working with Robert, does Robert go, oh, I go by Bob? So this is not that different, because cisgender people go by nicknames all the time. How many Johns do you know that are Jacks, right? Okay, so you can just kind of naturally work this in. Again, introducing your own pronouns, or like introducing yourself with your own pronouns, is also a really good way to do this. Now, next, you can actually ask people about pronouns. Like, you can literally, as you're going through your intake and you're taking notes as you're doing your intake, because I used to take notes as I was doing mine, right? Like, I'm checking the boxes. I might be filling out the application for the person as I go, but I'm also taking notes. You can say, like, once you say, like, what's your gender identity or like sex, you can say, what about like, what pronouns do you use? Now, the one thing, here's some nuance here. There's some people who are like, oh, but you shouldn't ask people their pronouns because then you could force them to misgender themselves if they're not comfortable disclosing, right? So there's that consideration. The other thing is if you're working with youth and there are, you know, adults in the room who they live with and they may not necessarily want to be out to them, you know, that could force that young person. But again, kind of thinking about the language that we use, you can say like, literally, and what pronouns can I use for you? Because then we can think about it as a situational piece, like, oh, situationally, yeah, I'm going to use she, her in this situation because I don't want my parents to know that, you know, but the other thing is you can ask people their pronouns and say, okay, cool. By the way, if any of this ever changes, that we can make adjustments. This is all fluid, and just leave it there. And then the question becomes, well, what happens when I have somebody who gets angry and goes, what do you mean, one of my pronouns? Can't you tell who I am? That's where you want to just have something in the can that you've rehearsed a little bit that says, oh, you know, our agency believes in being inclusive. This is the way that we demonstrate it. Because if you have something like that, if you kind of just like a quick can statement, that's something that you can kind of rattle off if somebody gets a little like huffy, that 99% of the time is going to diffuse the situation. So those are some ways, like, and yeah, in terms of how you go about changing it, the first thing I would say is like, talk to your supervisor, have your supervisor talk to their supervisor, then take it to the workforce development board, you know, so those are all options. And even, I don't know, I even think about ICSPS, like, I don't know what your all's role is relative to, I know you guys are doing a lot of professional development. Maybe it's something that we do for the board. Maybe you give this training, that you give them the link to this archive training to your workforce development board and say, we need to address this. So you can understand and use the language of the LGBTQ plus community. That's another thing that is like super helpful. So that's why you're here today. That's why I spent so much time talking about terms and definitions, so you like understand it. You can research memes and cultural references. You've noticed I've had a bunch of memes throughout it. If you go all the way back to the beginning, the meme that I had with like Ina Gartner, the famous chef, she's famous for, you know, being like, oh, if you don't have time to, you know, make your own chicken broth from scratch, store-bought is fine. So the joke on that is, you know, oh, if you don't make your own estrogen, store-bought is fine. It's for, you know, particularly referencing for trans women, like, hey, your body doesn't make enough estrogen for who you are. So, hey, store-bought is fine, right? So just kind of reference, like, you know, thinking about researching kind of when you see these memes, like, what are they saying? And likewise, when you see derogatory ones, recognizing how those might be terrible. So like this little like person, this little fuzzy, like Muppet looking person, that's definitely me. Like, I don't even respond. Like, you can say my birth name and I don't turn around anymore. Like, but I've definitely had this feeling when somebody has said my birth name. So, you know, thinking about some of those things. So particularly when we think about youth and students, so if they're, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, right? Like if somebody who's under the age of majority in particular comes out to you, you know, the first thing you do is thank them, because guess what? As Morpheus says, you are the chosen one. You know, and then ask that youth or student where they're out. Are they out to their family? Are they out to their friends? Are they out? Are they comfortable being out in your program, especially if you're doing group stuff? Like, you want to make sure that they feel safe. And you want to ask if there's anything in particular that they need related to their LGBTQ plus identity. And this is why you need to know about where your local resources are, because we understand our programs are tied. We can only spend money on certain things, right? But maybe you're working with a young person who really needs to get their hands on like a binder, right? Because that's going to help them feel most affirmed, and they're going to feel better, right, about putting on that fancy work shirt, putting on that button-down work shirt, right? So knowing where those resources are in your community and places and spaces that might be able to provide some of that stuff becomes really important. You want to be able to share local resources as well in the event that, you know, that youth needs safety. Like, and a lot of times there are going to be recommendations for like safe places and shelters. Obviously that gets trickier when we get into more rural parts. I get that, you know, that's going to be in some of your, there's better resources in some of your more urban areas for LGBTQ plus youth, but you'd be surprised. So you really want to strategize and listen to that young person. Bridget, anything else before I move forward? I think we're getting close to the end of these slides, which is good.
Yeah, no, people are just talking about the resources that have been posted in chat, DJ, and they will
Perfect.
all be shared in the Word document afterwards. And you've mentioned a lot more today that I've added into that. So if you got the Word document 2 weeks ago or whenever we were last on, there are extra ones in there today, and plus some of the Illinois documentation stuff. I've added that to the document. Somebody just asked about having the PowerPoint to print afterwards. And I think Kirsten said at the very beginning that they'll send it out at the end of the presentation as well, right, Kirsten?
Yeah, I can actually put it in the chat for everybody, and then it is on our website as well, and I'll put that link in the chat too.
Yeah. So yeah, and by all means, please, like, listen, we created this content to put it out into the universe, especially across, you know, all of WIOA, all 4 titles. I want it everywhere. I have no like qualms. We have no qualms. Like, we're like, please, if it helps our workforce system be more affirming and inclusive, we are all for it. So like, you know, SpongeBob, right? Here's another meme. Here's cultural reference, schoolwork with my dead name on it. Looks at it. Oh, let me put this in the fire. There we go. Right. Also very much me. Dead name, like that's a slang term for trans people's names given at birth. Right. So what else can you do? And this, by the way, is for all people, not just youth, but young people in particular. Like, we know, right? Like, part of what we do is some of that youth development and leadership stuff, right? This is an opportunity, right, to help them develop some of this as well. But you can model correct gender pronouns and name, again, as long as people are out, all right? You can actually like even correct other people as needed. So if you're sitting with a participant and perhaps you're working with a partner, you know, and your partner keeps misgendering the person, your participant, you can say, actually, you mean he, you mean she, you mean they. Like, you can just interject that real quick. That's good, right? Because I will tell you all, it gets exhausting to constantly correct people, like for myself. Like, so, you know, I have friends who even like, when some of the faculty members in my doc program kept misgendering me, like some of my cohort mates started putting in the chat and like, or like even interrupting the faculty on my behalf, which was nice because then I didn't have to do that labor. So you can model correct gender like pronouns and name. You can correct other people as needed. Don't do things like, what's your real name? I get it. We have to do, you know, our intakes, and you can maybe even think about your intake process and say at the beginning, hey, it's going to require, you know, we require like legal name. We understand if there's different names that you go by. I'm going to specify when I need your legal information because I have to have the documentation match. Just even kind of framing your intake conversations in that way can be really helpful and will demonstrate / signal to folks that you're here to see them and value who they are. The other thing we recommend, get involved. Build some relationships with some of your local LGBTQ+ resource centers. The other thing that we know is like the rate of homelessness and the rate of LGBTQ young people who are in the foster care system is way up there, because oftentimes, right? Remember when I said we don't want to out somebody because that can have real consequences, right? That's what I'm talking about. So, you know, building your relationships with your local LGBTQ resource centers, or, you know, the nearest one to you, is really something we would encourage. Assist in educating others. Love that you're asking for this slide deck and thinking about this. Yeah, take the slide deck, use it, right? Help educate other people. So create open and affirming spaces. There's flyers, stickers, intake forms, all gender restrooms. I think I have a couple slides that even have a link where you can like literally download the Glesson Safe Space poster. You know, do your best to create those conditions for people to disclose their identities without feeling, you know, judgment, because that's what they're going to do. If you are somebody who's working with students or youth and participants in group settings, make sure you have established comprehensive and clear anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies that include orientation, sexual orientation, gender expression, and gender identity. You know, that should include an opportunity for students and youth to report you know, incidences of that confidentially in some way. It should include strategies like restorative justice or positive interventions and behavioral supports, as opposed to a zero tolerance policy. And that's because we know that zero tolerance policies already disproportionately affect more marginalized populations. So the other thing, ensure dress codes and dress expectations are gender inclusive, right? Like, we don't need to say, you know, oh, when you're going on a job interview as a man, you should wear a shirt and tie, or you should wear a blazer. Like, look, clothes don't have gender, folks. We can just say, hey, here are some examples of appropriate, you know, interviewing attire. Perhaps, a shirt and tie and some chinos or slacks, right? Like, or maybe a blouse and a skirt with like, you know, not stiletto heels, but like a wedge or whatever you want to say. You don't have to gender it, right? We can just talk about the clothing neutrally, and we can put that out there about these are the appropriate things to wear. So yeah, final concepts to remember. Gender identity encompasses an inner sense of being. Gender identity is often understood before sexual orientation. Transsexual is an outdated term. So is like, you know, sex operation, sex change, even sex reassignment surgery. We really talk about those things as gender affirming procedures, gender affirming, you know, support. I said this earlier, trans and transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun. So don't, like, what we would say is like, oh, a transgender person, a trans man, a non-binary trans person, genderqueer individual, etc. We don't say transgendered. We don't say transgenderism. It's not an ideology. You know, we don't say a trans. We're not a noun, right? So also, please don't say to trans people, like when you find out that they're trans, because you have been assuming all along that they were cisgender, don't say I would have never have known you were trans. Like, it's just not a thing. All right. Like, please. You're not expected to be an expert, but you should be familiar with resources and legitimate organizations and have connections to ensure that support. So we did include some resources on the slide. So again, some of these are more the national level resources, kind of the big ones. So there's some really great stuff. And then I'm going to actually like X out of here, and then we can, I'm going to stop the screen share and we can figure out questions. And I know one of the things that I didn't mention, but I should have, you know, so what happens if you have somebody, you're working with somebody who is transgender, and let's say this person is transgender and they are, let's say it's a trans woman and she's in the process of transitioning, but maybe might still be assumed to be transgender because she also has not legally, right, transitioned, meaning she hasn't had the opportunity to legally change her name. So what do we do in the case of resumes? First of all, resume is not legally binding. So I always say somebody's resume should always, they should use their chosen name. There's nothing that says you have to use your, it says you have to use your legal name, right? In terms of an application, this is where we start to get into some of the nuance, right? Because oftentimes we know that employment applications will have that self-attestation statement at the bottom that says, I swear and attest to all these things to be true. And oftentimes the applications will legally state, you know, legal name. So what does somebody do in that instance? What does this trans woman, let's say her name is Sally Jones. What does Sally Jones do in this instance? Well, Sally could put down Robert Jones, and then when the employer calls and says, yeah, you know, may I speak with Robert Jones? At that point, Sally would say, this is Robert, but I go by Sally, right? Well, what has Sally just done? She's just outed herself as trans, right? So that's certainly something that our participants can do. Our participants may opt to write down Sally Jones, and they call, and, you know, the employer calls, Sally gets an interview, goes into the interview. Let's say it gets all the way through the process, right? Because at this point, Sally's a little further along in her transition, but, you know, her medical transition. But so now people are maybe even assuming that Sally is cisgender, and she gets hired and then hands over her documentation where she hasn't legally transitioned yet. And then what happens? The employer says, oh, you lied on your application. Now we have to let you go. Right? So that's another scenario that could potentially come up. So what do we do? In the end, we can only advise our participants about, you know, here are the things to think about, like, and recognizing what those implications are, right? We might say, oh, we know what they should do. And you might be inclined to like direct your participant that way. But I'm going to remind you that participants really, they're making their own informed decisions, right? So you might feel really strongly that the person should absolutely use their legal name and kind of disclose their transgender identity. but that they're not actually required to do that. And we really just need to make sure that our participants have all of that information so that they can make an appropriate, informed decision for themselves, regardless of what that looks like. So yeah. Are there other thoughts or questions? Because we have like 9 minutes. It's pretty good. I just want to thank you all for being here.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, DJ, but yeah, we're open to them. I've been answering some questions along the way in the Q&A as well as in the chat.
Yeah, and so Bridget included for the RSA 911. So for those, since there's nobody from VR here, let me just explain real quickly. The RSA 911 is essentially our data on the VR side that is much like your, much like the wizard data or the, what do they call it now? God, I'm so old. But just point being, like, if you were to include more options, but your management information system still just has only female or male, based on how someone identifies, you could then kind of code that so that if somebody says, oh, I'm a trans man, then you would just mark male. Because interestingly enough, what we found when we talked to RSA is that they actually are interested in sex as identified by the participant, and not necessarily like legal sex. And I feel like Whisper, that was it, the Whisper data. Like, I feel like that's kind of, it's probably similar. And there is a request for information out, I think currently, like the current administration at a federal level is looking for best ways to start collecting that information. And there's some suggested guidelines. So yeah, anyway, yeah. So thank you all for being here. Like, it was great. And if you missed the last one and you want some of that information, Kirsten can tell you where that lives too. So,
Yes, it is on our website, which I did put the link in the chat, but I'll put it in there one more time.
yeah. And like, yeah, it's so great that you're all here, and you're here because you want to like create inclusive environments. And that's, you know what, again, what I will tell you is don't be afraid. Like, and that conversation around grace, like if somebody discloses their identity and you thank them and you just say, hey, like, look, I'm trying really hard, I might mess it up. You know what? Most of the time we're going to give you some grace. Now, if you've been working with me for 3 years and you're still misgendering me, then I'm going to get salty, but this idea that somebody's going to jump down your throat because you misgender them once, most people we recognize when you're being authentic, and we're going to extend you that grace, And the other thing I'll say, practice. I tell VR counselors all the time, like, if I stand in front of the mirror before your client comes in and say their name and their pronouns using a sentence, like, 5 or 10 times, or write it down. If you're somebody, because you're old like me, because I'm a geriatric millennial, and they used to make us write the sentence over and over again, do that. Whatever works for you, you can practice, and it makes a world of difference to really be seen. And especially right now, especially with everything that's going on, when I wake up every day and I hear about new legislation that is targeting transgender people. So
DJ, there was one comment in the Q&A, and it was about using the most up-to-date language, not just with, pronouns and things like that, but also a person with a disability or a disabled person or things like that. And I mean, I think people's preferences are different. We're not all the same. We don't all prefer to be referred to in the same way. And this person was saying, well, how do I stay most current?
right.
My answer in there was, ask the person, because they're the expert on themselves and what they want. So I don't know if you have anything you would like to add to that, seeing as we've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, honestly, like, I don't. But I love that you're asking the question and really being, like, really thinking about it. One of the things that I encourage folks to do is even seek out some disabled activists. Alice Wong, the Disability Visibility Project, is really great. So that's it's all been archived, I think, through StoryCorps, and it's like literally, a collection of disabled folks telling their stories. Like, so something like that is like, that's good. But in terms of like, I wish there was like a website that like constantly updated, the language. I think also thinking about, asking the person, and then, this is where if you're staying connected or you develop a relationship with like a local LGBTQ plus organization, and or like a local kind of disability advocacy chapter, or that's where you might be able to keep up with some of that. But Bridget really is right. Like it's, it is about kind of asking folks and listening to how they're talking about themselves, and inquiring authentically. Oh, hey, like I've noticed that you refer to yourself as autistic. Would you prefer that I refer to you as autistic as opposed to a person with autism, right? Like, or would you, like, you talk about yourself as neurodivergent. Do you prefer to be referred to as neurodivergent as opposed to, somebody who has ADHD or whatever? Like, so yeah. I mean, social media is it's a cesspool, and it's also really informative all at the same time. And that one's hard to kind of like pull things out of, but I swear I keep up with a lot of the kind of advocacy and changing language. And so
if I could just put a quick plug in, since you brought up neurodiversity, DJ, and in terms too. So we actually also at IC, oh my gosh, I can't talk. At ICSPS, we actually have another project that we work in collaboration with ISBE on, and it is an autism technical assistance project, and we offer professional development on that as well. So similar to this conversation, in terms of knowing up-to-date language and just working with individuals who are neurodivergent, and kind of exploring that topic as well. We actually have a neurodiversity in the workforce panel webinar coming up, so quick plug in for that. And it's a panel of autistic individuals or individuals with autism, kind of just facilitating like their experience in the workforce and, how they prefer to be approached and just like their personal experiences. And so I think it could give a lot of you on the call today some insight specifically for that population of people and working with that population of people. So if you want to register for it, it actually did go out in our marketing that came out yesterday, but you can also register for it here on that website. I just put it in the chat. So not only being inclusive for the LGBTQIA plus community, but also for the neurodivergent community as well.
That's awesome. And PS, there's a lot of crossover. I think the statistic I just read is it's like those folks that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella, which is typically it grows, and again, this is kind of the example of like kind of the changing landscape, and it depends on how you're defining like neurodivergent. And if you define it as just that is socially and culturally different from the norm, which is, often thought of as neurotypical, then it gets even much broader. But, the very quote unquote kind of like more prominent groupings that tend to fall into neurodivergent include autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. There's another one there. But we also see, now we see OCD, I've seen everywhere from like OCD and bipolar to Down syndrome to really just anybody who kind of, cognitively might, navigate the world in a different way, as opposed to like those that are neurotypical again, because so it's, I love that you all are doing that, Kirsten. That's great. And like the first person experience, like hearing people with lived experience, I think is such an important portion, so it's awesome.
So I did also want to say that I put in the follow-up survey for this session. So if you would like to take a couple moments and give feedback on this specific session, as well as any other future workforce professional development that you'd be interested in, we do read the surveys. I know, they can be kind of redundant, but for quantitative purposes, that is the purpose of a survey. And we do read them. I read them. I compile the data and then present it to our WIOA Professional Development Committee, who helps us kind of generate the PD for the system. So I do encourage you to fill that out. And that is in the link and or in the chat, and it'll also be in your follow-up survey as well tomorrow. And then this session was recorded too. So if you want to reference it back, it'll be on our website, and in that follow-up email tomorrow. Typically the recording takes about 48 hours because we do have to edit the closed captions, but we'll get that up there and out to all of you. And then I just want to thank DJ and Bridget so much for their time on this 2-part series. I really appreciate it, especially with you traveling, DJ. And we think this was super beneficial to the system. And hopefully you all found it beneficial as well to just kind of take the time out of your day to learn and practice some new knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for being here and all your interest. Yay.
Yep. Thank you. And thanks for keeping the questions coming in.
All right. Everyone have a great rest of your Wednesday. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.